Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akeredolu with the headlines. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov welcomes Vatican offer to resolve Ukraine conflict, but Ukraine's stance prevents it. Russia denies planning to give up Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Russian President Vladimir Putin is using winter as a war weapon against Ukraine. From the Kremlin, where it says it will welcome a Vatican offer to provide a negotiating platform to resolve the Ukraine conflict, but Kiev's position made this impossible. Pope Francis has reiterated that the Vatican was ready to do anything possible to mediate and put an end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in an interview with the Italian daily La Stampa about a week ago. Asked whether he believed reconciliation between Moscow and Kiev was possible, the pontiff called on everyone not to give up.
No. We know that a range of foreign leaders and countries say they're ready to provide their ground for negotiations. With no doubt, we do welcome this sort of political will. But in the situation, which we now have both de facto and de jure from the Ukrainian side, these grounds cannot be in any demand.
Dmitry Peskov speaking about Pope Francis' offer to mediate in the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has confirmed that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine is still under Russian control and will remain so after a Ukrainian official had suggested Russian forces were preparing to leave. The head of Ukraine's state-run nuclear energy company had said there were signs that Russian forces might be preparing to vacate Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, which they seized in March, soon after invading Ukraine. The Kremlin has dismissed the statement. Russia and Ukraine, which both suffered from the world's worst nuclear accident in Chernobyl in 1986, have accused each other of shelling the complex, which has 6 reactors. And the charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Elizabeth Root, has told Russia's state news agency that Moscow and the United States have ways to manage nuclear risks at the level of intelligence agencies. Russia says that Moscow was open to more high-level talks with the United States, but the Kremlin dismissed the idea of a summit between President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Joe Biden as, quote, out of the question for now. Officials from the two countries were set to meet in the Egyptian capital of Cairo from November 29 to December 6 to discuss resuming inspections under the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty, although Moscow has played down the prospect of a quick breakthrough. Ms. Root also said that the United States and Russia continue to discuss the release of basketball star Brittney Griner and ex-Marine Paul Whelan through special channels.
The United States has channels for managing risk with the Russian Federation, particularly nuclear risks. And that was the purpose of CIA Director Burns's meeting with his Russian counterpart. Director Burns did not negotiate anything, and he did not discuss a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. I'm sure if there's a need for another conversation in that channel, it can happen. There's not anything scheduled that I know of. President Biden is committed to discussing arms control and to determining what the future arrangements will be after New START expires. In the meantime, we will continue to have discussions through the bilateral consultative commission, the mechanism of the New START treaty, and we look forward to when we will be able to resume the strategic dialogue. I can say that the United States continues to talk with Russia through the designated channel about the release of Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan. The United States, as we have said, has put a significant proposal on the table. We have followed up on that proposal, and we have proposed alternatives. Unfortunately, so far, the Russian Federation has not provided a serious response to those proposals. Until such time that we can provide full consular services, Russian citizens may apply for U.S. visas in any country where we have a U.S. embassy. When it comes to immigrant visas, we know that it is difficult for Russian citizens to get to Warsaw, which is the designated place for processing those visas. So we are working toward identifying other locations that could be more accessible. But again, our country is open, and we have ways for Russians to apply for U.S. visas.
Let me clarify, is this a European country, the other option for Russian people to apply other than Poland?
We're trying to identify other locations that would be more accessible for Russian citizens.
The chargé d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Elizabeth Rood. United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is set to set out a so-called evolutionary approach to countries including Russia and China as he delivers his first major foreign policy speech since taking office. According to a government press release, Mr. Sunak is expected to say in his speech to diplomats and business leaders at the Lord Mayor's banquet in London, quote, "Our adversaries and competitors plan for the long term. In the face of these challenges, short-termism or wishful thinking will not suffice, so we will make an evolutionary leap in our approach." UK inflation has hit record highs recently amidst political chaos and a cost of living crisis. The press release adds that Mr. Sunak will also stress the importance of reinvigorating relationships in Europe following Brexit, as well as his plans to deepen ties in the Indo-Pacific region. The Prime Minister is also expected to reaffirm Britain's commitment to Ukraine amidst Russia's war, saying the country will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Let's talk now to Mr. Chidi Warner, security expert, joins us on the line from the British capital in London. Good morning to you, Mr. Warner. Thank you for your time.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Let me start off with this big speech expected from Mr. Sunak about foreign policy. Quite complicated situation he has, and he doesn't have that much experience on the foreign scene. He's new among the big hitters on the international scene. I mean, when compared to the likes of Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden and a whole host of others. But he talks about long term. The relationship with Europe is complicated by how drawn out Brexit was and some of the ill feeling that was created when Mr. Johnson tried to back out of some of the provisions that had been agreed. Do you think he's going to make some headway with this evolutionary approach, as he calls it?
As you said, it's deeply complex. He has an uphill task. So there's several very important factors in terms of how we view it or how the world will view it in a geopolitical sense. So the first thing is everybody recognizes that Britain right now is in a very difficult place, not just economically but politically. Our political class is deeply fractured. The ruling Conservative Party is most likely going to lose their next election. So everybody understands that he's maybe at best got 2 years left of to do anything, and then he'll go into an election, most likely lose. If he's really lucky, he could come in with a minority government, but that's unlikely. So essentially, we're talking about a lame duck prime minister who, as you said, is inexperienced on the world stage, and is dealing with a completely changed world to the one that he faced when he entered Parliament, and is evolving continuously. The pivot away from looking at the European stages to Indochina or to the Indo-Pacific is again a little bit difficult, because the history of Britain again as a colonial power in the Far East is quite raw with people, and Britain now at a point when China is feeling quite vulnerable, stepping up to speak about these issues, it is going to create a lot of problems. Dealing with Europe closer to home, he has put to bed some of the issues that the previous governments from Johnson and Truss generated, such as the migrant issue, cooperating with the French, sending in more money, it looks like there'll be a pragmatic approach to the Northern Ireland issue, which again will settle things down. And at least he is recognized as not being an ideologue, as being a pragmatic person. So that should help. But there is always this, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's always this hanging over his shoulder that everybody realizes that he's politically weak and he most likely is not going to be there for long. So whatever he's going to do, he needs to do it. And if it's going to be something long term, whoever he's doing it with will want to have reassurances that this is something that will be accepted by all stratas of British political thought.
Let me bring you to something equally interesting, and now the conflict itself in Ukraine. The Pope has offered to mediate, possibly not for the first time. He appears to have been one of the few international leaders that has not been seen to take one side or the other in this conflict as it has evolved over the last 9 months. But how much of a chance does any kind of mediation that he could do have, especially given what the Russians say and have been saying, which is that there is a Ukrainian law that forbids any kind of negotiations?
Well, in this situation, I'm trying to say how to phrase this diplomatically. There's a phrase that Stalin, the former Soviet leader, used in, how many battalions does the Pope have? And that's what it boils down to. He's a moral figure. He can act as a peacemaking type figure. But in this conflict will be resolved by hard power. When the hard power is exhausted, then it will come down to negotiations. And the negotiations will always be based on those powers that can force either side or compel either side to obey them. The Pope can't do that. The best he can do is facilitate peace talks and, create that space where people can, start talking and passing messages and getting things back and forth. But in reality, he's not going to be the person, I don't think, I could be wrong. I don't think he's going to be the catalyst for peace talks. And even in the last, this interview that he just gave, he made quite a few very controversial statements. He labeled, the Chechens and the Buryats, who are Russian minorities, Chechens being Muslim, Buryats being Buddhists, as being the most cruel soldiers in Ukraine, which is a little bit, can be considered, either racist or sectarian, depending on how you want to look at it. He was very clear that while he didn't want to name people as who was at fault, he then made sure that he said, Russia is the invading state and Putin is the leader, the person responsible, which the Russian foreign ministry obviously was quite unhappy with. So it does put him in a strange position. But I think the bigger picture that we're looking at is the Russians keep talking about negotiations, and you need to ask why. The Russians have not achieved their strategic objectives, which is the demilitarization of Ukraine and the neutering of NATO. In fact, over the past 9 months, what you've seen is Ukraine has got a much stronger, bigger, more capable and competent and more confident army than they had in February, and they have inflicted severe defeats on Russia, not just on the battlefield, but in the face of world opinion. And more importantly, NATO has expanded. Sweden and Finland will be joining NATO most likely next year, with 2 very good militaries and good military industrial complexes supporting them. So until Putin can be seen to have either achieved some of his strategic objectives, such as either regime change or military defeat of Ukraine, or putting NATO in a position where it can't respond, it's unlikely that he's going to try and negotiate seriously. What you're seeing now is Putin trying to buy time to rebuild his forces after the severe defeats in Kharkiv and in Kherson and the attritional battles over the summer. His army is quite weak. You can see the problems with the mobilizations, with the men who've been coming in, badly armed, not being trained. He needs to buy time to train these men, arm them, and get them into the field. If he doesn't get some sort of a ceasefire, these men are going to be fighting over winter with no training, bad weapons and bad logistics and bad equipment. And, as somebody who has, served in a European army in winter, it is horrible. It is really horrible. And
yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because there were several people who I'd spoken to who said, look, winter is a natural pause to this conflict, during which peace talks, regrouping, rearming, re-energizing, strategizing about what has happened so far can take place, because the winter is atrocious, and it's particularly atrocious in the regions that we're talking about in Russia and in Ukraine. So I understand when you said, as someone who served in a European army in winter, it's really bad. I get it. But it does seem as if the momentum on either side, perhaps, has slowed down as a result of that.
Yes. Yeah. So the momentum has slowed down, but again, I could be wrong. Many people have been wrong about this war, but I don't expect the Ukrainians to stop. They have the initiative. Their morale is high. The Russians are on the back foot. The Russians, contrary to popular opinion, the winter does not favor the Russians as much as it favors the Ukrainians. Because again, going back to, what I was, referring to earlier, surviving winter is not just about, being naturally used to it. I'm a Black African who grew up in Nigeria. My is 30 degrees humidity, but I could function in winter because I was well equipped. I had warm clothes. I had, I was able to heat my food, and I was trained to survive in winter. As I was alluding to earlier, the Russian logistical problems are such that their troops don't have that warm weather equipment. They are not trained. They're not being well led, so they don't have that discipline to make sure. So, just to go into a slight kind of side, when you're really, really cold, what happens is you shut down. You don't want to do anything. You just sit down. We laugh and we call it, if you have a fire, you sit down and you just stare at the fire. You get just so lethargic and you freeze. If you're not disciplined, if someone's not there, on top of you, making sure that you change your socks, you change your clothes, you eat warm food, you just not, even though it sounds really stupid, you just will not do it because your body is shutting down in the cold. And the problem the Russians have is because their system has so broken down and they've lost so many officers, so many junior leaders, that doesn't apply. If the Ukrainians maintain their offensive kind of capabilities throughout this winter, that puts the Russians on the back foot. And that means that throughout the winter, their men will be in the field, in combat and suffering. And without that kind of fallback that I'm mentioning of the, a good logistic train to keep them sustained in the field. So I don't think there'll be massive offensives. Again, could be wrong. But I think there'll be a constant state of warfare just to make sure that the Russians can't relax, can't bring men out to the line to train them or to rest them. And then in the spring, you will then see a massive counteroffensive by either side.
I cannot let you go without asking you about some of the things that seem to have slipped by while everybody's attention has been focused on this war in Ukraine. We did talk about the New START Treaty, which is supposed to keep in containment the nuclear arsenals of both the United States and Russia. That is completely different. That's something that preceded the war in Ukraine. Right now, as we speak, in Europe, incidentally, in the same neck of the woods where the conflict currently is, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have border skirmishes. So I'm wondering if you think that perhaps we could let something slip which could become even potentially more dangerous than the war in Ukraine because our attention is not focused on it. Just yesterday, I believe it was, the North Korean leader gave the indication that his country is putting together an ICBM that can hit mainland US. Now, whether or not you believe that, if it happens, that's a complete game changer, and somehow it slipped through the cracks.
Yeah, so this is another really massive kind of issue or massive discussion that's happening, kind of in the sidelines, which is what's happening what's happening in the shadows, what's happening on the sides. And you've mentioned the border dispute, in Central Asia, and that again is indicative of the changes that you're seeing in the geopolitical frame. Now, under normal circumstances, Russia would have intervened, put both sides together. But now in Central Asia, people can see that Russia is weak. Russia does not have the forces to intervene and doesn't have the will to intervene, even if it wanted to. So you can see even in the conferences, people are now making Putin wait, not wanting to stand next to him for photographs. It might seem really small and petty, but when you understand the dynamics and the kind of drama that surrounds the relationship between Russia and what his former colonies in Central Asia, you'll understand this is the equivalent of somebody, the Nigerian president, making the Queen of England wait. That's the dynamic, that kind of embarrassment. So that dynamic has changed. That's what's happening when you can see the geopolitical kind of framework shifting. And then, but what I would emphasize, and then sorry, I'll just touch on the North Korea thing. In that North Korea, always, whenever there's a conflict happening that they're not the center of, wants to use that as an opportunity to get away with as much as they can, test as many weapons as they can, but also show the rest of the world that they're still there. Because the North Korean weapon program is designed not just to defend North Korea, but it's also designed to try and extract concessions from the rest of the world. So the more they threaten, the more they hope people will drive them to calm down. It's not happening because right now no one is interested. China has its own problems. The US has its own problems. So they'll keep escalating until something snaps. But what I think is most important is actually our own continent of Africa. That is where everyone's taking their eyes off the ball. If we look at the Sahel, there's a lot of things changing. The Russians are quite heavily involved there, both in the Sahel and in Central Africa. The Chinese, obviously, as we know, have economic investments. But the transnational non-state actors are spreading. They're fighting. And, even northern Benin, the Rwandans are saying they're going to go there. There's a lot of problems happening there from northern Togo, northern Ghana, Faso, Mali. There's a whole dynamic change. And this is where I think, the world is going to miss the ball, in that there will be something dramatic that will happen in the Sahel or, in that area, or in Central Africa, or even in East Africa, as we can see with the M23. And there'll be no capability or bandwidth in the rest of the world to deal with it. And we'll see, a disaster unfolding.
Wow. That's a really grim prediction there, but as you said, it could very much happen and slip through the cracks. Chidi, want to thank you as always. Interesting discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, United Nations calls humanitarian situation in southern Ukraine critical as people struggle without power and heat. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. We turn our focus now to the power outages in Kiev. The Ukrainian capital is experiencing yet another spate of emergency power restrictions in addition to already scheduled blackouts. Power supplier DTEC wrote on social media, quote, emergency power cuts ongoing in Kiev. This is a necessary step to balance the power system and avoid equipment failures, adding that it had been ordered to reduce consumption by 60% and that providing electricity to critical infrastructure, hospitals, pumping and heating stations required 58% of the remaining electricity. We do our best to supply electricity to each customer for 2-3 hours twice a day. As soon as we manage to balance the situation, we will return to scheduled outages. The sustained power outages come as Ukraine scrambles to find equipment to repair power infrastructure damaged and destroyed by Russian missile attacks. Meanwhile, Ukraine's electricity operator Ukrenergo says the company is running at a 27% deficit. Ukrenergo said in a statement on Telegram that it had implemented a series of emergency shutdowns across the country at several power plants. Given deteriorating weather conditions, power usage is on the rise, it added, saying that it hoped the power deficit would reduce as units return to operation. It claims that 7 waves of Russian missiles contributed to the recent outages. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Romania ahead of meetings with NATO allies and foreign ministers from the group of 7 advanced economies. A senior State Department official said Mr. Blinken will announce new assistance to help restore Ukraine's power transmission abilities in the face of Russian attacks targeting the country's energy grid later on. Washington has also been encouraging other countries to do the same, so Kiev can avert blackouts that leave millions of people in the dark and without heating in the middle of sub-zero temperatures. Moscow was trying to deny power to Ukraine's civilian population by targeting substations, the official said, adding that those cost millions of dollars but were vulnerable to the Iranian-supplied drones being used by Russia in Ukraine. Let's talk now to William E. Odom, Professor of Russian Studies Strategy and at the Policy Department of the Naval War College. I'm talking about Professor David Stone, joins us from Rhode Island. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Good morning.
I read something that seemed potentially very scary, and I wanted to get your view about it. And it still speaks to these things about other things slipping through the cracks while everybody's attention is focused on the war in Ukraine. the North Koreans have put in place a new nuclear policy that has decentralized who can press the nuclear button in case there are attacks on its leader and his small group of advisors who are closest to it. Now, immediately reading this, one can come away with the impression that if there was a mistake, if someone misunderstood something, there is no going back, is there? Especially when you're talking about nuclear weapons. And other countries like Russia, and indeed others like China and India and so on, who all have nuclear weapons, could have the same policy.
So that is true. And again, I'm speaking only in a personal capacity here. I think this is not actually that unusual in terms of the North Korean approach to issues. As your previous guest suggested, the North Koreans have always made it a point to say things that are provocative and to seek attention. And so what they're talking about in terms of changing nuclear command and control arrangements or trying to find ballistic missiles with more range are not fundamentally changing the equation. North Korea has had nuclear weapons for a while. It has been in a position to use those nuclear weapons potentially against U.S. allies or against U.S. possessions in the Pacific or on the West Coast. And so the recent rhetoric out of North Korea is alarming, but it's not unusual. And I don't know that it fundamentally changes the dynamic of the North Korean problem. This is just the way North Korea acts. And while the U.S. and North Korea's neighbors need to be concerned about this, I don't think that it's cause for panic. It's cause for the same sorts of things that we've done in the past, which is efforts to ensure that North Korea understands very serious consequences if they were to ever consider the use of nuclear weapons.
Let's go to Russia itself now. Indeed, it was one of the countries I mentioned when I talked about the North Korean policy. And there are those, of course, who have argued that the war in Ukraine seems to have diminished the Russian president's invincibility status, even amongst his own people. So you're having significant demonstrations now. And there are those who are even talking about regime change, the possibility that from inside, there could be an attempt now to change Vladimir Putin's position. Do you buy that, especially against the backdrop that this man has been in power for more than 2 decades and he knows his country?
So I think it is true that we're seeing increasing levels of popular discontent. Now, Russia is a police state, and so it's difficult to get good objective opinion polling of people's true views on Vladimir Putin. But there are ways of getting at people's levels of anxiety, whether they're confident of success in Ukraine, whether they're concerned about it. And those levels of concern and levels of anxiety seem to have been growing pretty steadily over the last year. So it's clear that the Russian people are not happy with how things are going. It's a very different question as to whether that discontent and that anxiety translates into political danger for Vladimir Putin himself. His regime has long experience in dealing with popular discontent. Russian elections are not going to be a mechanism for taking him out of power. And many of those who would have led a street resistance to Vladimir Putin or taken this to the public and taken it to the streets have left the country or are in jail. And so it's difficult to see popular discontent taking him out of power. Now, you also alluded to the possibility of something from within the regime. And we can never rule that out. It's impossible for us to know. The inner workings of that government are tough for us to get access to, and tougher under the circumstances of the war. There's fewer observers. The regime has sort of circled the wagons to try to protect itself. And that is always possible, but it's certainly nothing that anyone could depend on or assume that that's something that will end this conflict. It could happen at any point. I don't think the likelihood is high, but it is certainly always possible. But it's nothing that any responsible outsider could say, we'll just rely on that to end this. No, I think it's going to take something quite different.
Let's go from Russia now to Ukraine. As some of the stories you've probably heard this morning have been reporting, a lot of that country is in darkness. And this is happening at a time of sub-zero temperatures. And as my last guest was pointing out, having himself served in a European army during this kind of inclement weather, this is tough on soldiers. Now we're talking about civilians without heating, without gas, without water in many instances. Is this a good strategy on the part of the Russians, do you think, in terms of dispiriting the Ukrainians, especially the civilians now, who will probably have no training and no background for this, and may, in fact, have their health affected?
So the first thing to say is that whether or not it's a good strategy, it's a war crime. Deliberately inflicting suffering on civilians just to inflict suffering on civilians is a war crime. And the Russians have made it fairly clear that that's exactly what they're doing, that they are trying to make Ukrainian civilians suffer to try to end the war on Russian terms. Now, is it successful? I'm not so convinced that that's true. Certainly, the Ukrainian civilians are suffering. They absolutely are. But one of the things that seems to be true historically is that when suffering is imposed on a country at war, it doesn't make those citizens more likely to want peace. It makes them angrier. And it makes them angrier at those that are inflicting that suffering. And so I don't think that this is necessarily making Ukrainians more likely to want to end this war on Russian terms or make concessions to the Russians or accept the loss of territory. I think it may actually be having the opposite effect, particularly when Ukrainians have been doing pretty well on the battlefield. As you discussed earlier in the program, momentum seems to have slowed a bit given the nature of the weather. But certainly the Ukrainians have been outperforming the Russians in the last few months of the war. And given that, I'm not convinced that the Ukrainians will want to see this war stop. Certainly not at a point when the Russians are still occupying large chunks of Ukraine.
I can't let you go without asking about the country where you are yourself, the United States. There was a lot made when the Republicans announced that if they took one or both houses of Congress, then it wasn't going to be business as usual with Ukraine and the funding and armaments flowing so far. But they've tried, I think, to some extent to walk back some of those statements more recently, especially since they took only one, not both houses of Congress. Do you think that the Ukrainians perhaps have cause for worry, or Ukraine supporters in the U.S. have cause for worry because now you possibly could have a congressional gridlock when it comes to being able to fund and arm the Ukrainians to defend themselves in this situation?
Given the nature of the results of the last election, I don't think that's the case. And it was always true within the Republican Party. There were certainly those, particularly in the Trump wing of the party, that were much more skeptical of Ukraine assistance. But I think the bulk of the Republican Party still supported aid to Ukraine. And so the Republican Party's position, as I read it, was, and again, speaking only for myself here, was that they wanted more accountability. They didn't want corruption. They didn't want waste. And that's an easy political position because no one wants corruption and no one wants waste. And so it's an easy point to say we are against corruption and waste. But I did not see a grassroots movement among the bulk of the Republican Party to end aid to Ukraine. And given the way that the Republicans underperformed expectations in the last election, I don't think it's going to have a big effect on the dynamics of aid to Ukraine.
So you don't think that there's cause for worry, basically? Things will still probably go on much as usual?
If I were the Ukrainian government, I would have lots of things I was worried about, but the worries about U.S. support would be lower on that list. I think there were other things that would be more concerning. Ongoing supplies of ammunition, the status of the Ukrainian economy, manpower over time. Those are things that I think are a much more serious concern.
Yeah, because, I mean, if there's anything affecting the United States' continued support and supply, then all the others are likely to think twice about their support because the U.S. is leading this.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. But I do not see any sort of groundswell in the U.S. to cut off aid to Ukraine. I just don't see that there's much constituency for that.
I'm sure the Ukrainians would be saying amen to that. William Odom, Professor of Russian Studies, Strategy and Policy Department, Naval War College. David Stone, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Let's take a break. When we come back, of course, Laddie Williams of our business desk will join me, plus ballet star who quit Russia over Ukraine war finds feet in Georgia. So please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. And as promised, Laddie Williams is here. Morning, Laddie.
Morning.
The EU has failed to agree on Russian oil price caps.
Yep.
Should I be saying that in form of news, or should I be saying we said so?
Yeah, more like I told you so.
So that's
yeah.
it, because we already said that this
Yes.
agreement wasn't going to happen.
And it all started, you know, when we got the indications for the proposed, you know, price cap around $60 to about $70 per
Whereas
barrel.
oil prices are hitting 90, sometimes 95.
Exactly. So it's not so far off, you know, according to, you know, some people. They feel that it should be, you know, lower. Countries like, you know, Poland actually saying, you know, we need to see a lower, you know, price cap, maybe around $40.
Yeah, since this is supposed to be some form of punishment.
Exactly, and, you know, supposed to reduce the funding, you know, Russia's ability to actually fund, you know, the war. So they haven't reached a decision. It was expected, because at the end of the day, you know, analysts are saying that this cap, Russia has already said they will not sell to any country, you know, that places a cap, you know, on their oil prices or gas prices. And that would impact the market, because that will impact supply, you know,
Absolutely.
to the market, to the global market. So they have a lot to consider, you know, when it comes to this cap. And the deadline, December 5th, you know,
It's next week, Monday.
Yes, we're practically, you know, there. So it remains to be seen if they actually reach an agreement, you know, before then. But if they don't, then they'll have to go with a harsher alternative, which is a complete ban. That's the EU, a complete ban on oil and gas imports, you know, from Russia. And obviously, we know that's going to impact.
That's going to seriously impact, and maybe they may not agree.
Exactly. It's going to impact the European economy, you know, because they also need, you know, some of this gas coming. And obviously, we've seen countries like Hungary,
exactly,
you know, say that they are not. They're
not going to agree because they don't know what they're going to do without it.
They're landlocked states, and they rely, you know, heavily on these, you know, pipeline gases flowing through the pipeline. So it's a tough one. It wasn't expected to be easy, and we're already seeing, you know, cracks already with that.
Now, the Yuan share, the Yuan, of course, is the currency of China.
Right.
Has gone, as a proportion of the FX market in Russia, has gone from 1% before the war to 45% now. Massive increase.
Yes, and it's all, you know, with that great de-dollarization, you know, of the Russian economy. We've seen how, you know, the sanctions have, you know, impacted Russia. They've not been able to, you know, trade with, you know, some parties, you know, globally, and they've had to have, you know, friendly currencies and unfriendly currencies. So the Yuan, they've relied heavily on the Yuan, and when you check the Moscow exchange there, you see that the Yuan is getting a chunk of the ruble trades, you know, and we've seen that jump about 45%, and it's actually, you know, growing bigger there. We see it balloon to about 9 billion yuan. That's what was traded between the ruble-yuan pair, and that's taking a huge chunk. We've seen, you know, the central bank there in Russia talk about how, you know, this could pose, you know, some kind of risk, you know, for the Russian economy, because at the end of the day, the global currency is the greenback, and you know, nothing
that has happened has changed that.
Has changed that, yeah. So moving away, you know, does pose some risk, because at the end of the day, if, you know, something should happen and the yuan is not as secure as it should be, then the Russian economy
is going to get the blowback.
Is going to get the blowback. So it's something that, you know, we've seen Russia pushing for. They're also, you know, bullish on decentralizing payment settlements, you know, globally. So it's actually expected, because this is a country that's heavily sanctioned right now. They're looking for alternatives, and we're seeing the yuan a big subject for that.
How are the markets looking today?
So we saw the big drop, you know, yesterday, you know, with the protests in China. We saw markets and investors react to that negatively. But today we're seeing a jump, you know, in the markets, the oil market in Europe, and even the U.S. futures. And that's because there are indications that, you know, China might actually relax, you know, some of these COVID policies. Yeah. And we're seeing the markets react positively to that. But we're still expecting that they're going to address, we're expecting that address from China because the protests are getting really serious. They've escalated, but we saw some kind of, you know, reduction last night, but there's heavy police, you know, presence, you know, and the anti-riot police and all of that. So there are indications that they might actually relax, some of these COVID policies, and we've seen the markets react to that. But it remains to be seen, what we get from that address.
Indeed. Thanks, Ladi. Ladi, of course, will have this and other stories right after this on Business Morning, so do watch out for that. And then later on the day, Business Incorporated, checking in with all the world markets.
Exactly.
Thanks, Ladi.
Thank you.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to use the winter as a weapon of war against Ukraine. Speaking ahead of a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Bucharest, Romania, Mr. Stoltenberg said he expected the need to help Ukraine with its air defense systems would be one of the main messages from the meeting. Romanian President Klaus Iohannis said there was a need for further reinforcements of NATO's eastern flank, and he wanted the alliance to start drawing up concrete plans for where troops would be sent in the event of an attack in the region.
In the south of Kherson, allies are providing advanced air defense systems and different systems that can both address the threats that are represented by the different types of drones, but also cruise and ballistic missiles. And I expect that one of the messages from the foreign ministerial meeting here in Bucharest will be the need to further step up the provision both of air defense systems, but also, of course, spare parts, training, and ammunition to the different air defense systems, because we need to help Ukraine to defend themselves against this horrific type of warfare.
The United Nations says that the situation in the southern Ukrainian cities of Mykolaiv and Kherson remain, quote, dire and critical. Nearly 250,000 people in Mykolaiv alone face a lack of heat, water, and power. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said that humanitarian coordinator Dennis Brown visited the two southern cities over the weekend, and Mr. Brown reported that people fleeing Kherson are going to Mykolaiv. Mr. Dujarric says, quote, some heating points have already been established in Mykolaiv to help people who cannot heat their homes. Aid workers are providing supplies and generators to make these places functional. In the sports news from today's coverage of the war in Ukraine, the United States fencing treasurer Sam Cheris has accused individuals of buying votes to influence the International Fencing Federation's decision on whether to reinstate athletes from Russia and Belarus, with a vote on the subject now pushed back to March 2023. He alleged that a representative from the International Charitable Foundation for the Future of Fencing, a sports charity based in Moscow, has been paying administrators to support a reversal on the ban of the two countries who are currently suspended due to their government's involvements in the invasion of Ukraine. The organization was founded in 2005 by FIE President Uzbek-born Russian Alisher Usmanov. He temporarily stood down as president of the FIE days after the Ukrainian invasion, after the European Union imposed sanctions on him due to him being a Russian oligarch. And when Laura Fernandez's fellow dancers at the Stanislavski Theater in Moscow began discussing the war in Ukraine, she knew she would have to leave. Swiss-born, but with a Ukrainian mother, the 24-year-old was a soloist at the Stanislavski and rising star of the ballet world when Russian President Vladimir Putin sent troops into Ukraine in late February. She also feared for her relatives in her mother's hometown of Mariupol and the impact it was having on her mother's mental health. She's enjoying new life now in Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, but has not given hope of returning to Moscow. Well, good luck to her. And that's where we'll end the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri-Doluale. There are updates throughout the day, but in particular, watch out for the world today at 5. But for now, have yourselves a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.